On the 28th of January 1914, Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist, would unknowingly send millions of men to die in fields all over the world. Gavrilo had killed a man that day, but not just any man. He had killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the crown of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, thus turning the empire's wrath on a country he'd so desperately tried to defend. Serbia would be on the spotlight of the world, with only its Russian allies to defend it. Thankfully, Russia had allies of its own in France and the United Kingdom, who, although neutral at the beginning, would play major roles in the war. This alliance, known as the Triple Entente, would scare Austria-Hungary to the point where they would look for help in Germany's Kaiser, Wilhelm II. On July 5, 1914, Germany would pledge its allegiance to the Austro-Hungarian Empire in any case of war. This allegiance would come to be used not long after, due to Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia on July 28, 1914, thus starting the then known Great War, what we know nowadays as World War I. World War I would see conflicts arising all around the world, but the two arguably most important fronts were the Eastern European Front and the Western European Front. The Eastern European Front would see the Austro-Hungarians, Italians, Russians, Ottomans, and Germans play a major role in the defense of each of their nations. The Eastern Front would see the constant back-and-forth battling in between the Russians and the Germans, until political unrest forced the Russians to retreat from the war in 1917. Yet Russia's support had distracted the German and Austrian forces from the Western Front long enough for the Allies to win important battles, for example, the Battle of the Marne. Even though the Bolshevik Revolution would retire the Russian army out of the war, the Italian forces still fought valiantly in the battles of Isonzo from 1915 through 1917, and even though the Italians would lose at some point, they would quickly regain their territory with help from the Allies. Lastly, on the Eastern Front are the Gallipoli campaigns, which would wage war on the Ottomans at their home front. These campaigns were led mostly by British forces, and even though most of the main battles would be lost, the Allies would still manage to bring the Ottomans to their knees, eventually forcing them to leave the war in October of 1918. All of this happened simultaneously with battles in both Asia and the Western Front. On the other side of Europe, another war was being fought, a war characterized by standstills and the brutal atrocities of war. A characteristic of this field of war was the use of new technology. Among those new technologies were things like planes, especially the new Fokker models, and the use of tanks, especially lighter tanks. The Western Front would see battles such as the First and Second Battles of the Marne, which would last years on end and have casualties in the millions, especially in specific parts of those battles like Verdun or Somme. Thankfully for the Allies, the United States of America would enter the war on April 6, 1917, after some German submarines had attacked American passenger ships, especially the ship Lusitania. This would prove to be the beginning of the end for the Kaiser, and not long after that, in the months of October and early November, both of its allies in Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire would surrender to the Allied forces. With not much to be done and the incoming pressure of the Allied forces, the Kaiser would abdicate in 1918 and leave the newly founded German government with dealing peace amongst the Allies. Not long after the surrender of the rest of the Central Powers, Germany would surrender in November 14, 1918, thus ending World War I. Yet this was not completely over yet, for Germany would have to settle its debts with the people it had harmed. The Treaty of Versailles would be signed at the end of World War I to denote what would be done with all parties who took place. This treaty would demand the following from the German Empire, who had essentially no say in the entire formation of the treaty. They would have to pay reparations to all countries affected by the war, chiefly among those France and Belgium. They'd have to reduce the size of their military to 100,000 men in demilitarized areas like the Rhineland, which was the area of Germany closest to France. They'd have to lose all of their colonies abroad, which would be taken by nations like the United Kingdom and Japan. They'd have to lose land in the mainland, and you have to give some of their citizens away to neighboring nations. And they'd have to take full blame of everything that happened in the war, which would especially damage German pride and leave relations tarnished for any foreseeable future. World War I would end up being one of the bloodiest and most vicious wars in human history, with over 37 million recorded casualties and enough economic loss in the billions. Sadly, millions of civilians would die during this war, and its cruel end would bring a wake to a war that would far outscale anything seen previously.